Hey, welcome to the second part of my BN application modding guide series. The first part I will be linking in the description if you haven't watched it yet. I included a pretty hefty intro where I sort of explained the phases of modding in terms of issue scouting, actually modding, and then posting the mods. So if you haven't watched it, please watch it. I also explained some other things like how you should pick maps for your BN applications. So yeah, definitely watch it if you haven't watched it already. If you have watched it, welcome back. Essentially, at the end of this video, I explained that the map I was modding was, out of the three maps being the bad map, the good map, and the map that is a little bit better but has issues separate from the bad map, I picked that third option as this map, as the map for this video, right? The second video is going to be about the bad map, and I'll repeat it again. The bad map does not necessarily mean that the map is absolutely awful from a new mapper who doesn't know any mapping fundamentals. It's just from a mapper that usually does know some basic fundamentals about mapping, just executed them in a very poor manner. They also usually include more meta issues. For example, having a hard that's very hard for what is a hard difficulty meant to be, or a normal that is, again, too hard or too easy for what it's meant to be. Those types of issues, so spread issues, for example. And the map I picked for this video is Till Death, Nightcore and Cut version, mapped by Mosby. Now, obviously, I don't want anybody to harass this person because I called their map bad and BN appable, so please don't do that. It's just that this map has specific issues that I think are great to demonstrate the BN application process with, and it's a great BN appable map, you could say. So yeah. As I said, I'm not going to go through like the whole intro process again of explaining everything. I've already explained the first video. If you haven't watched it, please at least watch the intro. But anyways, we can start going through the map now. Now, obviously, the first thing you do once you find the map that you want to mod is go into mapset verifier and check if there are any issues that arise here. And you can see it's mostly clean, but on the insane diff here, it says potentially burai. Now, if you're a newer OSU player or mapper, you might not know what burai means. Burai is essentially when sliders have a path that is ambiguous and you can't tell what direction it's actually going in. So we can just go onto the map, the insane diff, which is what the mapset verifier is picking out, and go into this slider, potentially burai. Now, this slider is not actually burai. The reason that it's detecting it as possibly burai is because of this section right here, which kind of goes in on itself. However, this does not count as burai, and it's perfectly rankable. So that's not an actual problem here. And again, it catches something on HS, which is the hit sound diff. However, it's a hit sound diff. It's going to be deleted from the set. It's only there to keep hit sounds that they can copy throughout the rest of the set. So this is not, these are not any real issues here. All right. So with that beginning setup phase over, we can actually start modding, and we will again start through the lowest diff, the normal diff. All right, so now we are on the normal, and just like last time, the first thing we do is go into difficulty here and check for all the difficulty settings. HP3, CS3, AR6, and OD4 are all within the guidelines for a normal diff, and combo colors are also fine. Now, there is something I failed to mention, and it is the fact that I have actually looked at the set entirely before. I haven't typed anything down, but I have a general idea of the issues I want to point out. Specifically, I did that because this is supposed to be probably the most important mod in a theoretical application, because it's the one with the largest amounts of serious general modding, and so that's why I already checked the map sort of beforehand. However, I didn't really check for timeline mods. Most of the things I looked for were specifically like set-wide or diff-wide issues. So there's still value in going through the entire diff aside from just the general issues. But I will go through like the issue scouting phase here for every diff regardless, just so you can get a proper idea of the things that I found, the issues that matter, and how to post about them. So yeah, let's just start with the normal. All right, so I'm immediately gonna nitpick this. You have like just vocals here before the instrumental starts, right? So he does passive rhythm. But then here, when the instrumental starts, it'd be cool to like differentiate this from this one by having slightly more active rhythm. So for example, here, I would probably do something like this. This would be cool. And this is not included in the general mods that I'm thinking about doing. So I'm just going to immediately post that as a mod for the normal. Sorry if I hit the mic there. I'll actually move a little bit to make sure I don't hit it as much. Could make slightly more active for instrumental start. All right. All right, so this is where one of the first issues on this normal arises. You'll realize that a lot of these chains are very long, and especially like this one here, which includes 3 active 1/2 rhythms in a row. For a normal, as the lowest difficulty of the spread, and on one of the least intense sections of the song, this seems overly dense and unnecessary. So that's going to be one general mod. So I'm going to immediately post that here. I'm going to order it from top down. Rhythm density on intro is quite high. All right. So as you can see here, the song starts building up, but it's essentially all the same density that it was before, despite the fact that it was far less intense before. Now you'll also notice this is very high rhythm density, especially in terms of active rhythms. Not to mention, they're also spacing out a lot of their 1/2 like this. And now we go into the first ki and the first sort of drop of the song. And again, you can tell they're using the same amount of chains. However, in between the chains, they have very large sliders, or 1/1 sliders, I guess, being reversed. But this is a very large gap with no clickable rhythm. And it's repeated. So in general, what you end up with is having this section feeling essentially the exact, like it has the exact same rhythm density as this section. And while they do have a very slight slider velocity difference, this is barely noticeable, 0.05. And so it also barely affects spacing. So essentially, these two parts are identical in terms of strain, in terms of difficulty, despite the fact that obviously this ki, this chorus, this drop is a lot more intense. Aside from that, also, the rhythm choices here is a little bit confusing. As you could obviously tell from this part before, essentially all the rhythms focus and prioritize on the vocals. And he starts this ki by doing the same thing. He starts by prioritizing the vocals. But since the vocals are kind of held here, he immediately pivots to the synth noises and maps them with a reverse slider. Personally, I believe it would be much better to map the vocals somewhat like this instead. At least like map the held vocal with a held slider. And then you can map the synth. And this one as well. So you could do something like this. Because this is more clearly following the vocals, not hyper focusing on the synths like he does, which feels a little bit awkward because obviously new players, as I said in my normal video, have a hard time constantly switching between different rhythm choices. And so focusing on one singular rhythm choice while it's active in the song, obviously, is usually a lot more intuitive. And so that's why I would pick this rhythm choice instead. And that applies to these ones as well, obviously. Alright, so I'm going to post that already. As a general, a different one. So yeah, what we said is about this section being very dense and just as dense, if not more, than this section here. So section before ki is just as, if not more dense than ki itself, despite intensity difference. There we go. Oh, that is an accidental circle. Okay, so here we have a little bridge section. Oh, sorry. Okay, so here on the second ki, you'll notice that he does increase density, which would be good as it contrasts with the other section of the song, which are less intense. However, in terms of being a lowest diff normal, this is a little bit too much. So this is a 166 BPM song, which is slightly below average. However, let's look at these chains here. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 passive 1/2 gaps, which could be perfectly acceptable if it were not also for the fact that it has 4 1/2 sliders, one of them being a reverse slider, also 3 active 1/2 rhythms in a row. This sort of rhythm complexity mixed with the rhythm chain is extremely straining, extremely difficult for new players. As in, these chains could be acceptable because they're generally simple, aside from the active 3 1/2 rhythms in a row. But then you only have 1 1/2 slider, you have a big reverse slider, so it's a little bit easier. But it's only here where he really picks up with the reverse 1/2 sliders, multiple 1/2 sliders, multiple 1/2 actives in a row, and because of that, it's a lot more difficult. So you should definitely be avoiding this as a lowest difficulty normal, even at this BPM. And again, he repeats this sort of thing again. Yeah, so that's another general post. Second ki is so high density that it's not really acceptable as a lowest difficulty normal for the spread. So this section just kind of builds down, so he's obviously building down his rhythm density. Now this last section is literally the same exact thing repeated over and over again, and you can tell he's adding some rhythm variety. And then a big long slider. Now I will immediately say this, this type of rhythm variety is not a problem, and if you were to post about this here, it would not be taken well, in my opinion. So obviously this section is extremely repetitive. It's essentially the exact same rhythm for 10 seconds. And the mapper kind of just varies between sliders and circles kind of arbitrarily. However, both or any rhythm choice, works here. And so it's not really an issue if he has this rhythm variety, even if it's a little bit inconsistent, because as a normal diff player, you're just listening to the song. It's just a constant 1/1 synth beat over and over again, and so it doesn't matter if it's 1/1 sliders or circles, it's essentially the same. So I'm not going to make like another general mod specifically about this because I don't think it's worth it at all, especially in the context of the other issues we already mentioned for the normal. Alright, so I only posted a single general mod here. There's probably a couple others that you might have posted. However, the reason I don't really mention them is because a lot of them are likely going to be mentioned as examples in my general mods, and they're usually going to be fixed through those general mods, so it's not necessary to post those as timeline as well. Alright, so it's the normal done, we can move on to the hard. Okay, so let's just start with the hard. See here, I like this. He starts with less active rhythm and then goes to more active rhythm when the instrumentals start. That's nice. Okay. So here we're gonna start noticing a little bit of an issue. On a hard diff, on an intro section, you don't really need to map super low intensity hi-hat 1/4 like this. It introduces a lot of rhythm density in a very low intensity section of the song. However, this does fit into a larger general mod about this difficulty as a whole, so I'm not going to mention it yet. And as you can see here, he's using a lot of varied spacing. So this is still 1/2. All these gaps are pretty big between each other. And then of course he goes back to using very small gaps for the 1/2. So he's transitioning from pretty low spacing on the 1/2 to very high spacing. Not only that, he's also mixing using 1/1 stacks with 1/2 stacks, which by itself isn't really an issue. On hards you can mix stacks pretty often, and it's not as much of a big deal as it is in normals. It's just that combined with the issue of also varying your spacing by this much, it creates it's a lot more difficult than your average hard, I would say. And then if we keep going here, okay, so this is pretty standard hard rhythm. But then here starts picking up with some 1/4, which is nice because the song picks up. And then we reach this first ki section. Now this ki section is extremely dense in terms of its, or not extremely dense, I would say. It's dense. It has a lot of 1/4. It's mostly 1/2. It doesn't have any 1/1 gaps. But aside from that, it's also using variable spacing, and it's also using spaced 1/4, not just stacking everything. And everything is spaced apart. No stacks here. Well, except when it's a weaker vocal like this. So you see a lot of variable spacing within even the same pattern like this, along with spaced 1/4 and very heavy use of it. And then we just move on to this bridge section again. Again, a lot of 1/4. This is 1/4 reverse sliders with spacing between them as well. It's not overlapped or anything. And then we reach the second ki. So here there are actually no stacks. It is just continuous movement with a bunch of triples in the middle. And as you can see, it's been a while since we had a 1/1 gap. And it finally stops here. So that is a total of, from here. Okay, so from 102, we can keep moving here. And until 130, so about 30 seconds of drain time, there are no 1/1 gaps, while also featuring a load of active 1/4 being spaced with also variable spacing and generally high slider velocity as well, which is something I haven't mentioned yet. And then this is just kind of standard mapping for the rest of the map. It's just sort of repeating the same thing. So if you haven't caught on to sort of the main issue throughout this hard that I've been trying to mention here, is that it is very hard for a hard. When mapping hards, there are a certain amount of difficulty elements that you have the choice to apply on your hards. So for example, variable spacing is a difficulty element that you can add to hards. There's also high rhythm density through use of a lot of 1/4. There's also higher slider velocity. There's also mixing stacks. There's also all these types of different difficulty elements. And usually if you use a couple of them within each hard, it's perfectly fine. The hard still plays like a hard. It's fine. The problem is when you're mixing every single one of these difficulty elements on your hard, you end up with a diff that is much harder than what a hard should be, essentially. So even though you should not do this, by the way, you can tell by the star rating that this hard is pretty high intensity. So for example, the normal here is only 2.2 stars. The hard is 3.9 stars. The insane is then 4.9 stars. Essentially, the point I'm getting at is, even though obviously you shouldn't trust in the star rating system for everything, even the star rating can represent how difficult this hard is compared to your average hard, as in the spread between it and the normal is very high. And that's mostly because of it using very high spacing, variable spacing, high slider velocity, using a lot of 1/4 and making it spaced 1/4, as well as a whole 30 seconds uninterrupted of just 1-1 or no 1-1 gaps, I mean. So all of that combines into a big general post, which I'm gonna type out now. General. Hard overall features way too many difficulty elements, which together make it too hard for a hard. The spread from the normal to this diff is essentially too high. So the normal, aside from a couple KI sections and the part before the KI, was essentially fine as a lowest difficulty normal. It was just those sections that were too high in density. However, with the general mods that would improve the rhythm choice there by making it less dense, the gap between this normal and this hard would be far too high. And so that's why we also need to go on the hard and say, hey, this hard, it's very difficult for a standard hard. It has a lot of different difficulty elements that together make it a lot harder for the spread than it should be. And so that's really the only thing that matters for me in this hard right now, because it's almost so globally encapsulating of the entire difficulty that you don't really need to timeline mod much at all. So yeah. Actually, forgot to check the difficulty settings for this one. HP4, CS 3.8, AR8, and OD6. So it's actually completely fine in terms of difficulty settings. It's just everything else about the map that should definitely be changed. And so with that, we can move on to the insane. Alright, so I won't forget this time. I will check the difficulty settings on the insane. It is HP5, CS4, AR9, and OD8, which are perfectly reasonable for an insane diff. And so we can get started. Oh, I forgot to put the audio on, sorry. Okay, so I'm immediately going to complain about something here in this section. So throughout this entire section, he's been obviously prioritizing the vocals. And then here, he starts by prioritizing the vocals, but then completely sort of ignores the held vocal in order to map the kick and the snare. And then here there's actual full vocals for the 5 circles, so he maps 5 circles, obviously. And then again here, it's just a vocal here with a kick and a drum that he still maps with circles. What I would say is that it would be better instead, especially considering this is an insane diff and not the top diff, to map the vocals with a slider here, so that these rhythms are differentiated from these rhythms when these ones are obviously a lot denser in the vocals, which are what he's been prioritizing for the entire map. And so these sections would be differentiated through their rhythm density. So that's actually not related to a general post. It's more of a timeline thing. So I will post that. Both of these. Rhythm could follow vocals with a slider for differentiation with the full 1/2 spam vocals. Alright. Alright, so something I'm obviously going to mention about this section is that he is using very active rhythm. Now, you could make the argument that the vocals are denser here, which is why he's using a lot of active rhythm, which is true, but even with the denser vocals, he's still mapping some held vocals as actives, which kind of just feels like forcing the pattern and forcing the density for no reason. So for example here, even if we were following vocals as actively as they actually are in the song, this would end up being a slider like this. And you would obviously also control G this. There we go. I would actually prefer this to be a 1/1 slider. There we go. So here he actually starts following the vocals. Alright. You can also notice that throughout this entire section, he starts with spaced out jumps, then he goes into stacks for the vocals going down in intensity, which is a nice touch. It provides good contrast between the more intense vocals with the less intense vocals. Then we move on to the ki section. Now an issue that I'm going to mention here is the following. Essentially, this ki introduces 1/4 rhythm. So about once every measure, there's a double from a slider or a triple. So it introduces 1/4. But aside from that, the rhythm in general is less dense. It features a lot more sliders than this previous section right here. This is just fully active rhythm. Very few sliders until the vocals start picking up here. So what ends up happening in this case is that despite the slight density increase, these sections don't really play that differently in terms of their strain, their difficulty. And if we could just moving on here. This section, which should generally be the most intense section of the song, again, plays almost exactly the same as the last part here. As in, the spacing is extremely similar, the density is extremely similar. The only real difference here is this section here, where the rhythm builds up more and the spacing builds up more. But the entire section as a whole plays essentially the same, has the same rhythm density, has the same spacing, essentially the same. And then the rest of the map is pretty standard. So this is another general mod, just as the normal and hard had general mods. I'll actually post it on the top part here. So general spacing on the section before the first ki. Oh, not just spacing, or not spacing. General density section before the first ki makes it not very different in terms of strain between it and the ki itself. The same applies to between the first ki and the second ki. So I'm gonna point out a couple timestamps here. This is extremely dense rhythm on the section right before the ki. Then again, this is just like the same type of spacing patterning as the ki. Then if I just compare these patterns with these, they're essentially the exact same in terms of spacing, density, everything. In general, contrast, sectional contrast between these different parts of the map could be heavily improved instead of being so similar. And that's essentially the main issue I have with this insane diff. There's not many issues aside from this. Generally, patterning is okay. It's not something like worth posting about. It's nothing special either, but there's no real issue with it. It's just that sectional contrast is very limited between these three sections. As I said before, the ending just kind of is standardly mapped like the normal in the hardware. Into the supposedly Blu-ray slider. So yeah, that's essentially the insane for you. So now we can move on to the expert. Alright, so for the expert, the first thing we do again is look at the difficulty settings. We have HP 6, CS 4.2, AR 9.2, and OD 8.5, which are all perfectly fine for an expert. So we can go on to the actual map. So again here, he does kind of the exact same thing he did on the Insane, with not following the vocals. And instead of just prioritizing the kick snare. However, I don't think it's worth mentioning on this expert, simply because it is the highest diff, and using sort of this higher density rhythm could definitely be justified by wanting to differentiate it from the Insane diff, wanting to have more of a spread progression from the Insane diff. So I'm not going to mention it on the expert itself. I think mentioning it on the Insane is enough. So I definitely think this is facing a little bit stupid for the song that is extremely fading out here. It was fine here because the vocals were still very high intensity, and the song is still going on with reasonable amounts of intensity, but here it just completely dies off, but spacing just remains super high. Spacing too high for low intensity, or fading intensity I should say. Alright, so let's just keep going. So again here, he's kind of using the exact same concept as the Insane diff, mostly following vocals with higher spacing for the higher intensity vocals, lower spacing for the lower intensity vocals. And again, he does the same type of thing where he ignores the vocal here in order to just keep the pattern going here, which I don't find to be the best idea. Again, I just prefer if he did some rhythm choice like this instead. Actually, I'd probably just do a 1-1 slider here. And there, this is what I meant. That would have been better in my opinion. There you go. So essentially, it's the exact same as the Insane diff, but higher spacing. And then this guy section is again basically the exact same as the Insane diff, but higher spacing. Which brings me onto my next point, which is essentially the issues in sectional contrast in this expert and the Insane diff are essentially the same, as in these sections are just overdone through having a bunch of spaced out jumps on everything, and then that spacing just sort of continues onto the PI here, and due to the relatively lower rhythm density with the amount of 1/2 sliders everywhere, the strain contrast between the sections isn't high either. So they essentially end up feeling extremely similar to play. Again, we just have the small little bridge section here. And this section is again just sort of jump spam with the same type of patterning that I used before. Now, I will give credit for the fact that, unlike the insane diff, this section is a lot denser, and it just goes full on jumps, which does create a lot more contrast between this section and the sections before. However, I can easily just point to, for example, this whole entire part, which only has a single 1/2 slider in the middle of it, and then look at this. And the only real difference is that the spacing here is a lot higher. So it just means that not necessarily that this part should be buffed in terms of spacing or rhythm density, but more so that this section is too similar and should be nerfed, which is the main point. So again, I'm essentially going to just say the exact same thing as the insane diff. Same sections as insane diff have the same lack of contrast between them, especially in terms of density, that make contrast minimal. Okay. And as a caveat, second ki is notably harder than relative to rest of the map than it was on the insane, so that part is probably fine. Okay. Although another thing that I could mention is the fact that in this section, he actually has a lot of highly variable spacing. So it goes from very high spacing to very low spacing to again high spacing to again low spacing like this. And that might not seem like a big deal. It might seem like, oh, it's just easier because the spacing gets lower. However, it's not necessarily true, because generally it's a lot easier to aim if the distance between objects is pretty consistent. You don't have to think about like changing your cursor acceleration. It's always maintained. While if there's constantly variable spacing, you have to change that that momentum all the time. So what ends up happening is that this section might actually end up being a little bit harder than jumps on this section, just because here you can keep your cursor going at the exact same speed the entire time. Momentum doesn't change, while on this section you have to constantly be switching between the high spacing ones and the low spacing ones. Constant spacing switching in the part before ki actually makes it kinda harder than the constant jumps on the other kis. That's another reason why the contrast isn't the best. And within this second ki itself, there's another issue that I can get to, which is the fact that spacing doesn't really change for intensity of the synths here. So you can measure this spacing here, this spacing here, this spacing here, this spacing here. They're essentially all the same, despite the fact that if you listen to the song, you have the synth constantly going up in intensity. So the spacing doesn't really change to represent that. He is going in a rotation here. He's constantly swapping direction, but in reality, it's just kind of going in a circular flow direction. So it's not like it's really making a big difference in terms of contrasting the different synth intensities here. It doesn't really vary spacing at all for this entire section. So that's a separate general mod that the insane diff didn't necessarily have. Spacing essentially does not vary on second ki, despite synth intensities being variable. Actually, I might have to recheck the insane real quick, just make sure that also wasn't an issue here. No, he definitely did increase the spacing. I even talked about this pattern before. And also increases the density, which feels appropriate for the higher intensity synths. So it is solely an issue on the top diff. Well, that seems very unnecessary. I think this concept would be fine if the general stream was a little bit lower intensity, because it is a generally lower intensity section of the song. So if he did something like this, I think this would be fine. It's just the way it's executed right now seems a little bit too straining, considering the rest of the map. Oh. There we go. And then again here we just reach the end part where it's just extremely boring rhythm. That just repeats itself because the song repeats itself. And then again we just have a very big slider, just like every other diff. Yep. Alright, so again, it was basically just, wait, did I type it insane here? I meant to type general. It's basically just general post, again, as it was on the insane and the hard and the normal. So what I was saying about this set being mostly general post was in fact correct here. Now again, just like last time, I didn't post anything on general all difficulties. This is because despite my efforts, there doesn't seem to be really anything all diff postable. I've checked the MP3 quality and it's perfectly fine. The metadata is all correct. There's no issues with combo colors at all. And all the tags are fine. However, we now reach a stage that I haven't reached before because there wasn't this difficulty on the last spread that I modded, which is hit sounds. I did not mod hit sounds on the last spread, aside from a couple missing whistles that were obvious in the diffs themselves. But here, with a hit sound diff, it's a lot easier to listen for inaccuracies in the hit sounding itself, because you have a dedicated diff for it, and you can tell if the mapper skipped anything. And then you can look at the diffs, see if they actually matter, that the mapper skipped it or not, and that's it. Alright, so to check hit sounding, the first step is always to check the hit sound volumes throughout the map. Now we can see here that he started with 55% volume for the beginning section, then the volume gradually increases until the first ki, in which it peaks at 85%. After the first ki, in the bridge section, he reduces audio back to 60%, and then it goes back up to 75% and back to 85% as the second ki starts. After the second ki, it goes down all the way to 60%, and then it gradually decreases as the song's intensity decreases until the very end of the map. So in terms of volumes, this makes perfect sense. It's not too high, it's not too low, it's just appropriate for the song's intensity, and we don't really have to change anything about it. So the first step before you actually check hit sounding is something I always recommend: reducing your music volume down to about half of what you usually do, and increasing your overall volume by a little bit, because this helps make the hit sounds stand out a lot more when you're listening to it, which is good because a lot of the times they can blend in with the song, and you can't really tell if a hit sound is off or not. So I always recommend to do this when you're checking hit sounds. And so we can just go on and actually check them. A quick tutorial if you're not aware. Basic hit sounding essentially entails using whistles for following the melody, which is usually the vocals, or it could be the piano or guitar if that is what the song has, or synths, as it is the case mostly throughout this song. The second thing would be claps. Claps are used to hit sound snare drums most commonly, and then you can either use normal hit normals or drum hit normals, which are these things here, normal and drum, to hit sound kick drums. And then the last really main one is finishes. Finishes are used to hit sound cymbal crashes usually. And that's all you really need to know for basic hit sounding. Now, there are some other aspects. For example, hi-hats or tom drums are also instruments that are commonly hit sounded with different hit sound samples. But the main four are those four, and it's usually just fine for majority of the songs that are mapped. So with that all out of the way, we can go on to actually checking out the hit sounds. So in this beginning section, the mapper just follows vocals and pretty much all the diffs, so it makes sense here that he's only hit sounding whistles for the vocals. I find this a bit awkward. Every second beat here, you can hear a pretty obvious snare drum every time, or a clap, which would fit with a clap sample. That sample is exactly what it would be in terms of hit sounding. However, he completely ignores them. However, I do remember that, at least on the expert diff, he does follow these actively. He's following the snares actively. So not hit sounding it and only focusing on the vocals with whistles is a little bit odd. So I think that's going to be the first thing I mention. There should be claps every second beat here. Like this. Now the only issue I could see from doing this is that the clap sample, as opposed to every other sample in the section, which is just whistles and a finish, is very loud and overwhelming. And I couldn't really just tell the mapper to reduce volumes, since that would also reduce the whistles, which would make the whistles also lower volume. So in comparison, the claps would still be very loud. So what I could do is do this. So I go here, and first I'm going to type out HS mod. And for this section, the claps / snares every 2 beats are completely unhit sounded, even though they're actively followed at least on the top diff. Now again, the issue with these is that the sample might be a little too loud, so what we add as a caveat here is that what they could do is add a different snare sample, a different clap sample that is lower intensity, specifically just for this section, so that you can add claps and add the feedback on the active rhythms, at least on the top diff, while not completely ruining the volume by making the snares super overwhelming. Could add a different lower intensity clap sample for this section in order for them not to sound too overwhelming relative to the rest of the section. So that's just my first point. We can move on with the rest of the hit sounding. Okay. So both kicks and snares start in the song here. So he starts hit sounding with normal hit normals and with claps. No, that sounds very weird. Okay, so there are technically some synthesized cymbal crashes here, I guess, but they're very low intensity. They sound very overwhelming. I think it's fine that the volume doesn't really change for this part because it's already at what? Actually, okay. Actually, no, actually, this should be lower volume. Wait, where is it? Yeah, this is 70%. The fact that volumes don't decrease at all for this section, especially with the finishes here, which are very loud, they sound extremely overwhelming. Okay, so I'm gonna say, firstly, volume should very sharply decrease here since the instrumental dies out and the vocals are fading. So let's pretend that we would do something like 40% here, which is the lowest hit sound volume he has on the map. I still think the finishes feel overwhelming even with this low volume. I don't think these synthesized cymbal crashes here are worth hit sounding with finish because they're just not that intense. I think this one's fine. I think it's a little bit more intense and it's also a full measure, or not a measure, actually yes, a measure from the next finish for the transition into the next section. But these two, I'm not too sure about that. I think they're very overwhelming. Yeah, so I'm just gonna post that. Finishes here feel very overwhelming for what is very low intensity synthesized cymbal crashes in the song, which just remove them. Okay, that's really it. We can move on to the rest of the map. Yeah, so they have all of these triples here, which aren't actually in the song, but throughout his higher diffs, oh, sorry, that was my phone, sorry if you heard that. Throughout his higher diffs, he does overmap these with additive rhythm, which is why he's hit sounding them in the hit sound diff with whistles. It's perfectly fine. Oh, what was that? Oh, I get what happened here. Those the only ones? I guess so. Essentially, what happened here is that there's a kick and a snare, or actually there's a kick every single beat and there's a snare every second beat, and so every second beat he has both a kick and a snare. However, on these first two second beats, he has the kick and he has the clap for the snare, but on additions here it's set on auto instead of soft, which makes the clap it turns the clap into a normal hit clap instead of a soft hit clap, which is what he intended to do, like this. Now that sounds proper. So that was just a mistake on his part. Additions should be set to soft, since currently normal hit clap is being used instead of soft due to it not being set. Right. Oh. Oh. So for the end section here, he changes his kick sample from normal hit normal to drum hit normal. I'm guessing that's because the kick does change. It changes intensity. It sounds slightly different. So I guess it's a fine way to represent that through using a different sample. And then song ends. Yeah. So aside from those issues, I think the hit sounding is fine. So firstly, this beginning section, the claps or snares are completely ignored, despite the fact that he does follow them actively, at least on the top diff. What about the insane? Also on the insane. The hard? Even the hard, they're mapped actively, at least half of them. So yeah. Then this section, oh, volume does not decrease at all. Even though the instrumental almost completely dies out and the vocals are fading out. So keeping a whole 70% volume here feels very inappropriate. And then here, yes, finishes for very low intensity sounds here, which are not worth putting finish samples on. And then the last one, the incorrect addition was selected here for these claps. Exactly like this, which is accidental. The rest of the section was hit sounded correctly. Wait, was it this section? Oh, it was this section, never mind. This is the correct section. Okay. So with all that, we have a proper hit sound mod for general all difficulties. Again, there isn't really much else to post. Metadata is fine, tags are fine, combo colors are fine. So all that's left for general all difficulties is solely about the hit sounding. And with that, we can move on to the final stage and the very long stage of this video, which is typing out every single one of these mods with proper wording and all that jazz, so that it's properly understandable for the mapper in order to help them improve their map. So yeah, see you then. Alright, so now we can get to actually typing out all the mods. You might have realized through that jump cut that it is now like almost 3 weeks since the last time I recorded. That is because I actually moved, because I had to move into a completely different city for university, and I am now going to university, my first year, and so yeah, I've been pretty busy. But I have found a time to finally record this video, and so this is where we're at. So we just have to type out all the mods, but with a twist. Kirishima Osu, say hi.
Hi, it's me.
Kirishima Osu, also known as a Beatmap Nominator. He has been a Beatmap Nominator for around 3 months now, very competent,
Yes.
and he will be helping us out on wording out some of our mods, because we will need some professional BN help here. And forgive me for making your eyes bleed with this banner. Anyways.
Wow.
Anyways, we can get on to actually typing it. So
Alright, so let's go.
So the first thing we have to type out is the hit sound mod. Essentially, first issue here was that claps and snares on every 2 beats of this section are completely unhit sounded, even though, for example, the top diff, they are actively followed. So that sounds very off. So that's what we have to word out really quickly. Wording is already pretty much set in stone. We just have to make it not grammatically incorrect. For this section, the clap/snares every 2 beats are completely unhit sounded, even though they're actively followed, at least on the top diff.
Basen.
What do you want?
Cannot see the notes.
Fuck. Hello, Kiri. Now you can see the notepad,
Hello.
right?
Yes, I can. Thank
Okay, good job.
you. Okay.
You could add a different lower intensity clap sample for this section in order for them to not sound too overwhelming relative to the rest of the section. Wait, is this? Hold up. Could add a different lower intensity clap sample. What does he have here? Oh yeah, it's because the current clap sample is very intense. It's extremely loud, and so putting that one here would be a little bit too much. So that's why we need a lower intensity clap sample for it, in order for them to not sound too overwhelming relative to the rest of the section. And that is it for that. Oh, yes. So here, the intensity of the song drops off very quickly, but the volume stays at the same, like 70%, which sounds very overwhelming. So yeah. Volume should very sharply decrease here since the instrumental dies out and the vocals are fading. Would do like 60% on this, 50% on, there we go, 40% on. Okay. And then there's these two finishes here, which sound very intense for no reason. The finishes here feel very overwhelming for it is very low intensity. Synthesized cymbal crashes in the song, we'll just remove them. And we don't really need to add much there. It's a more minor suggestion, just a very weird hit sounding choice. Additions should be set to soft since currently normal hit clap is being used instead of soft due to it not being set. So for some reason there are normal hit claps here because he didn't select soft additions, and it's clearly unintentional because in the following section he hit sounded with the proper soft claps. So that's the issue here. Additions should be set to soft since currently normal hit clap is being used instead of soft due to it not being set. There we go. Alright, so that is a quick hit sound mod. It's probably going to be the easiest thing because I pretty much already typed out everything that was needed. And now we get into the very large part of this section, which is all the general posts that I didn't really word. So as a little recap, and especially for Kiri here, since he's looking at this for the first time, rhythm density on intro is quite high. So the issue here, Kiri, if you look at this map on my stream, normal diff,
Yes.
is that this part. So this is still in the intro part.
Oh, okay.
And he has like chains like this.
Yeah, a lot of sliders in a row.
And he does the same thing here.
Okay. Active rhythm. Okay.
Stuff like this.
Oh, okay. I see what you mean. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So that's the issue. And so the mod here is about just generally reducing that sort of rhythm density.
Yeah, some very intense rhythm choice, very active rhythms, a lot of sliders. So you just want to minimize those.
Yeah.
For the slower part.
Especially if you just like look at some other parts, it's just similar types of chains, so it's bad for contrast as well. All right. So rhythm density from around until is overly dense, or yeah, is overly dense despite the song being extremely low intensity. Using slider chains which include reverse sliders, using patterns with 3 active 1/2s in a row, mixing the 2 previously mentioned concerns in the same pattern, etc.
Wow, I worded that in my mind just like you did.
Oh, wow. Good one.
No wonder.
That's why
No
you're
wonder. Who's my mentor?
that's why you're a beat map nominator, Kirishima.
Exactly. You look so good at doing that. Have you ever tried being a beat map nominator?
Wow. Highly recommend reducing the rhythm density through use of more passive rhythm and ignoring some lesser vocals over more intense ones. So let's give an example for each of the bad examples that we saw. So I think this is pretty simple. We can simplify a lot of the vocals here into a type of pattern like this. Yeah, exactly. Some examples of what you could do on the mentioned patterns, at least. And on the last modding video, I tried to use embeds with Imgur, and Imgur does not embed properly onto the OSU site right now. So I'm just going to post images on Imgur and just post a link to it because I'm way too lazy to use a different site at the moment. And so I will just take a screenshot of this rhythm right here. And we'll save that. And we will post it to Imgur. There we go. Here, all we need to do is just simplify that so it's not nearly as much active rhythm. Like that. What was that pattern? 13, 330. Yep. I'll just screenshot that. Oh, to name it something. 2. And then the last example, which was at 16 seconds. That's all we really need to do. So I can screenshot that as well. Name it 3 and post it on Imgur. Oh, need to post a timestamp as well. And there we go. Okay, so that's that general mod done. About rhythm density in the intro section with some examples. Now we can get onto the second mod. Alright, so Kiri, listen up.
Yes.
Section before Ki is just as, if not more dense than Ki itself despite intensity difference. So essentially, if you look at the stream here, you'll see these chains with a bunch of active rhythms together, and they repeat over and over, and then it transitions.
Yeah, those are a little bit too straining.
It transitions into the Ki, and it's like sort of the same density. Doesn't change at all despite the obvious song intensity difference.
Yeah. And even if it did, just like the overall rhythm choice is not that fitting, so it would need like major changes, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I would think this is like an advanced or hard sort of rhythm choice.
It could definitely be. If this was like more spaced out, like a hard diff spacing,
Yeah.
I would easily say, yeah, this is a hard diff rhythm. Okay, so this section before the first ki is basically as dense, if not denser, than the ki itself, despite the obvious intensity difference in the song. These rhythm chains, like with high amounts of 1/2 active rhythms and 1/2 sliders, are just as dense as similar patterns in the ki, like etc. Overall, rhythm in the section should be nerfed in density to add some contrast between it and the ki. Similar to what I said in the intro density mod, this can mostly be done through using more passive rhythm and ignoring less important sounds over more important sounds. Oh. Examples of what you could do. So here we want to avoid having this big of a chain at all. Oh, let me just copy that timestamp. There we go. There we go. So we've added an extra gap. We've removed the 3 active 1/2 rhythms in a row. So now we only have 2 active 1/2 rhythms in a row right here, and only one of them. We also removed that circle there, but that's for the other pattern, I guess. So screenshot of this. That'll be named 4. And there we go. Next pattern. This one. I could make this right here. There we go. Sort of following the vocals here more actively. So I can screenshot that. Call it 5 and post on Imgur. And then just etc. because I don't really need to give more examples. All right. Then the last general mod. So again, Kiri, I want you to be here on the stream. Yeah. So second KI is so high density that it's not really acceptable as a lowest difficulty normal for the spread. So if you look at this second KI, you'll notice.
Yeah, it has the same issues we were looking at, but a little bit more amplified.
Yeah, like these chains are
a little bit worse. Yeah,
chains are even longer. There's like 3 active 1/2s here. Same thing on this one. Super long chain, a lot of 1/2s.
Basically, this is not a normal diff rhythm.
This would maybe be appropriate if the song was like 130-ish BPM.
Yeah, 130-ish, like an alt song normal.
Yeah, but at this BPM, this is just too high. At most, you'd have like which is this, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
6 or 7 would be okay.
Yeah, with active rhythms though, that's a bigger issue.
Yeah, active would be lower.
For example,
especially 3 active rhythms.
If the gaps were something like this type of thing, it'd probably be more acceptable because there's a lot more time in between each active rhythm. But with this, with a lot of 1/2 sliders, 1/2 reverses, a bunch of active in a row, it becomes a lot more problematic.
Yeah, on normal diffs, 1/2 sliders, they're considered one of the most straining objects because you need to like be very mindful of your stepping and aim on this object.
Yeah, which for completely new players, they don't even understand how sliders work. So
they don't understand that, so it's way too straining, this kind of rhythm.
It's always simpler to just go for single circles, 2 circles in a row, maybe that type of thing, and avoid long chains like this, obviously. So
obviously, yeah.
the second PI is so high in density with its chains that are fully composed, or almost fully composed technically, composed of 1/2 sliders, 1/2 reverse sliders, and 3 active 1/2 circles in a row, all in the same chains. At this rhythm density at this BPM isn't really appropriate for a lowest diff normal, being more similar to what you would see in advanced diffs or even some low-end parts. Again, just like the other density issues, here are some examples of what you could do instead. Oh, like that. So the idea here is that we want the rhythm to still be relatively dense, because it is like probably the climax of the song, but we just don't want it to be like entire chains of objects in a row that are just way too dense. Like, for example, in this first guy, it's definitely more manageable because there's big technical rhythm gaps with like these 1/2 reverse sliders. So it's a little easier. Here the issue is that it's just like 1/2 reverse sliders, 1/2 sliders, circle spam all over the place,
Yeah,
and that's a
and
lot
3
harder.
octave rhythms in a row everywhere.
Yeah. Actually, I want to place a reverse slider here. Oh, I have an idea. No, this is better. Then if we sort of repeat the same thing here. Yeah. So screenshot that. Number 6 and post on Imgur. Oh, the chains. Each chain like. I want to give the mapper some alternatives here in case they don't like one of the specific examples. So for example, the first alternative I made. This one here. Number 7, post that on Imgur. I don't really see a need here to map that with circles. And this one back to 1/1, since the 1/2 on the white tick isn't as intense. Actually, it'll just end up being the same example as the first one, because it sort of repeats the exact same sound. So 8. That's it. Those are the 3 chains. So we can leave it at that. Okay, and then we did have a singular timeline post, which was just changing this singular 1/2 reverse slider into a 1/2 into circle to have a differentiation between this first one and this first one, or second one I mean, because this one has no instrumental backing in and this one has the song starting. And that is the entire mod. It's very simple.
Yeah, this is the kind of mod that you would need like to mod the map twice because of the general posts, and you can't really mod many timelines.
Yeah, because these general posts include a lot of stuff.
Yeah, there are major things that need to be changed.
I think this first one, or second one I mean, should definitely be a problem stamp. This second one as well. The first one is not as bad as the other one, so not a problem stamp. There we go. Could turn this slightly more active with a 1/2 slider into circle to differentiate it from, since the instrumentals pick up here. And that's really it. So normal is now fully modded and worded. And the hit sounds are also fully modded and worded.
Good
Now
stuff.
we can move on to the hard, which had one very big post.
Oh.
So Kiri, I want you to look at this hard for a bit.
Yes.
So it starts off as a pretty standard hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot of 1/1 gaps. Okay. Seems pretty reasonable.
Yeah, it seems fine so far.
Okay, a little bit more active. Still fine.
Yeah.
It's a little bit suspicious here with the stack mixing, but you know, it's still
a timeline post, but still fine. It's nothing too big.
Okay, that's pretty weird. I don't know why the spacing just went up so big.
What? What? Oh? Why the sudden spacing change? Okay.
So he has some spacing here.
What is happening?
But
it's turning into insane.
If you've noticed, there has been no 1/1 gap since the last section.
Mm-hmm.
Despite the fact this is a pretty low intensity part of the song, it's just very high rhythm density.
Didn't really change much from the previous one. Yet the big rhythm density change. And then, yeah. Okay, I see the issue. It turns into a light insane. Or insane diff.
Yeah, so there's a lot of variable spacing used here. It goes from like this sort of low spacing to like 3 times the spacing for each of these. And not only for downbeats, just for normal sounds as well. There's a lot of space triples. So overall, a lot of cursor movement here. And the rhythm density does not go down either. And then finally we get more in the normalcy here again.
Yeah, it's way too dense.
And then we get here to this part.
What the? Yeah, that's not a hard diff.
So it's just no stacks at all in this section. It's just a complete distance snap plus spacing differences plus space triples plus no gaps. So all of this together makes for a very difficult hard.
Yeah, he took contrast to hearts.
A little bit too much.
A little bit too much. And then it goes back to a hard diff at the ending. Yeah, okay, so you're supposed to have contrast, but not like that.
Yeah,
Not like that.
it's not supposed to go from hard diff to light insane. It's kind of similar to the normal thing, where this would maybe be fine in like a 130 BPM song, but this is like 166.
Yeah, it's not really.
Like having 0-1-1 gaps on a very low intensity section mixed with like a very dense rhythm on the kiais, too dense, with no stacks really, with space triples everywhere. It's a little bit overdone, and that was the main issue with this hard. So that's actually going to be a problem samp general mod addressing all of those.
Yeah.
This hard diff features too many different difficulty elements which combined end up making it more like a light insane type map and not so much an actual hard diff. Mainly talking about this until like here. Since the intro and outro are basically fine. List of difficulty elements combined within this hard includes stack mixing of different rhythm gaps in the same pattern, massive spacing variation for relatively low intensity vocals. No rhythm gaps for this entire part. No rhythm gaps for this entire section until the first PI, despite it being still relatively low intensity. Spacing variation included in this first PI outside of important sounds like along with
Hello.
a bunch of spaced out triples. Oh, I hit my mic.
I had some minor technical problems.
What happened?
My power went down for a second, but I think it's okay.
Damn, I didn't even notice.
You didn't? What?
Nope.
Oh.
I don't know, you didn't leave the voice chat. I didn't hear it, actually. Probably because of streamer mode.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
This entire second TI being completely devoid of stacking for 1/2 or 1/4. Including massive amounts of active rhythms. With no gaps even where they would be appropriate, like I'd like to emphasize that none of these difficulty elements by themselves are issues. It's just that the combination of all of them within the same hard diff is a little bit too overwhelming for newer players. To resolve this, I'd recommend the following. Add rhythm gaps for this section so that density isn't so high on relatively low song intensity. You can add them by removing the circle and moving the 1/1 slider 1/2 a beat earlier. Same for this. Yeah. Oh, I forgot to mention this big spacing here first. Don't use this massive spacing between objects here. The song is very low intensity, and this increase doesn't fit the song at all. Oh, I saw your DM. My power went down for a second. Bruh. Next one will be yeah, okay. Remove spacing, move higher spacing from patterns like where the higher spacing isn't really emphasizing anything. Spacing on stuff like is fine. However, due to the higher intensity / downbeats, or both, and move the spacing from the triples, or at least reduce it heavily. Finally, add more gaps here where I mentioned on the previous paragraph. And that's it for the general mod, pretty sure. So let's just read that real quick. This hard diff features too many different difficulty elements which combined end up making it more like a light insane type map and not so much an actual hard diff, mainly talking about 24 until 122 since the intro and outro are basically fine. List of difficulty elements combined within this hard includes stack mixing of different rhythm gaps in the same pattern, massive spacing variation for relatively low intensity vocals, no rhythm gaps for this entire section until the first ki despite it being still relatively low intensity. Spacing variation included this first ki outside of important sounds like this and this, along with a bunch of spaced out triples. This entire second ki being completely devoid of stacking for 1/2 or 1/4, including massive amounts of active rhythms with no gaps, even where they would be appropriate like this and this, etc. I'd like to emphasize that none of these difficulty elements by themselves are issues, it's just that the combination of all of them within the same hard diff is a little bit too overwhelming for newer players. To resolve this, I recommend the following. Don't use this massive spacing between objects here. The song is very low intensity, and this increase doesn't fit the song at all. Add rhythm gaps for this section so that density isn't so high on relatively low song intensity. You can add them on here by removing the circle and removing the 1/1 slider 1/2 a beat earlier. Same for this. Remove higher spacing from patterns like this and this, where the higher spacing isn't really emphasizing anything. Spacing on stuff like this is fine, however, due to the higher intensity / downbeats. For both 47 and 111, remove the spacing from the triples or at least reduce it heavily. Finally, at 111, add 1 gaps here where I mentioned on the previous paragraph. Yeah. Oh.
Very good. This is the big one. Probably the main post of the entire mod.
Yeah, it's probably the biggest one. This insane and top diff about contrast might be roughly the same size, but this is probably going to end up being bigger anyways. So yeah, that's a lot of words.
A lot of words.
Hello, this is just a quick little addendum before we move on to the next section of properly wording out the mods on the insane at the top diff, something that I forgot and that I realized a little bit later. So firstly, on the normal diff, these 3 mods don't actually have to be separate. I realized afterwards that it makes a lot more sense for this to be a whole overarching mod about contrast, mainly through rhythm density being kind of off. It just mentions like 3 different sections, so it's better for them to be together on the same general mod as like a problem stamp. So I'm just going to quickly do that. This normal suffers from some severe contrast issues due mainly due to unfitting rhythm density that I will now describe. And then the first one about the intro. Rhythm density from around 10 to 24 is overly dense despite the song being extremely low intensity, using slider chains like these ones, which include reverse sliders, this one which uses patterns of 3 active 1/2s in a row, this one mixing the 2 previously mentioned concerned of the same pattern, etc. highly recommend reducing the rhythm density through use of more passive rhythm, ignoring some lesser vocals or more intense ones. Some examples of what you could do. I already have all the images here. This section before the first ki is basically as dense, if not denser, than the ki itself, despite the obvious intensity difference of the song. I'm going to have quick separation here, just so that each section that I'm mentioning in the mod itself are separated by like a little line, so it's not too like hard to read, I guess. This section before the first ki is basically as dense, if not denser, to ki itself, despite the obvious intensity difference in the song. These rhythm chains, like this one, with high amounts of 1/2 active rhythms and 1/2 sliders, are just as dense as similar patterns of the ki, like this one and this one, etc. Overall, rhythm in this section should be nerfed in density to add some sort of contrast between it and the ki, similar to what I said on the intro density part. This can mostly be done through using more passive rhythm and ignoring less important sounds or more important sounds. Examples of what you could do, etc. This second ki is so high in density with its chains that are almost fully composed of 1/2 sliders, 1/2 reverse sliders, and 3 active 1/2 circles in a row, all in the same chains. This rhythm density at this BPM isn't really appropriate for a lowest diff normal, being more similar to what you would see in advanced diffs or even some low-end hards. Again, just like the other density issues, here are some examples of what you could do instead. Could map each chain like this. Okay, so that's the first addendum I wanted to make surrounding the normal, but there is something else that I completely forgot in the actual issue scouting phase. So when I was issue scouting, I talked about the rhythm in this first ki, and forgive me for using a different skin from the default one. I am doing this extremely impromptu. Essentially, this rhythm was kind of confusing because he ignored like actively following the vocals in favor of the synth here, which also sort of created these chains. And I think this is like suboptimal, not very intuitive rhythm. And so the idea here was that essentially these rhythms should be changed. And I already had the suggestion. I even made the suggestion in the issue scouting phase. I just completely forgot about it, and then I didn't type it out. Rhythm for this first ki could be heavily improved by focusing more on the vocals instead of constantly switching over to the synths, which would make rhythm a lot more intuitive for new players. Instead, could use rhythm like, and then the rhythm suggestion that I made was this right here. Like that. And this still fits with my whole density mod on this first big general post. Because Mapper is going to nerf this section. So this slight nerf by adding a technical gap here isn't that much of a big deal. And even with the rhythm adjustments here, there's still going to be contrast between them. So it still makes sense with the mods that I did. And so I'm going to take a screenshot of that. And I will upload it to Imgur. It is using the Pishifat skin instead of the default skin, but at this point, I don't really think it matters. It's the same for every chain. There we go. There we go. So that's really the addendum I wanted to make, because I only realized afterwards how sort of confusing it looked, like having basically the same issue on 3 separate sections being on separate mods when it could just be combined into one massive wall mod. As long as it's like properly formatted, it's not big of a deal. It doesn't really matter the length of like your general wall mod posts, as long as they're like easy to read, easy to understand, and not like just repeating the same thing over and over. And so this is fine. And then just this general mod that I completely forgot. So yeah, that's basically all the addendum. We can now move on to the insane and the top diff section.
All right, so we're here in the next day. We're gonna look at the insane and top diff now.
Yes, thank you, Kiri. Thank you for the transition. All right.
No problem.
So anyways, my main issue in this insane diff was essentially that this section before the ki is like overly dense for the song's intensity, to the point where it's like just as straining to play as this actual ki section, which is a lot more intense. So obviously here you have like the addition of this 1/4 pattern every downbeat, but in general there's a lot more sliders and a lot less circles, so it ends up being sort of the same amount of strain. So contrast is very little. And then same sort of applies to between this ki and this ki, where this ki is essentially like the exact same thing. The only real contrast here is this specific jump where spacing does get bigger, but everything else in this section is just basically the exact same thing as this first ki. So very little contrast between this section of the first ki and the first ki and the second ki. And so that's what we're going to word out right here. General rhythm density of the section before the ki on makes it not contrast that well, since it's essentially just as straining. Well, the first ki includes an addition of 1/4 rhythms. In general, it uses a lot more sliders and less circles, while the part before the ki uses a lot more circles, most of which being jumps of similar spacing to the ki. Oh, I actually already had this timestamp here. I did not need to copy it. This type of rhythm chain, or this rhythm chain, is the most obvious indicator of this. I highly recommend reworking the rhythm to make it more passive, so that contrast between this section and the first ki is improved. Oh, and then examples. So here you could obviously simplify these stacks into just 1/2 sliders. So these pairs of circles could be replaced with 1/2 sliders. And could be replaced with a 1/1 slider for the vocal. And then the same rhythm suggestion for that. Now the second part of the mod is pointing out that the same sort of thing happens between the first ki and the second ki, and essentially asking that the mapper make the second ki contrast more apart from the first one. So the main thing here is gonna be adding some more of this type of thing, more like spacing variation for the synths instead of just being the same thing. Yeah. Same issue applies to a degree in terms of contrast between the first and second PIs. They use essentially the same rhythm density. The only real spacing difference comes from a single jump pattern on right there. I would recommend adding some more spacing variation in the second PI for the synth pitches, since having more variable spacing makes makes cursor movement more varied in velocity, which is a form of difficulty that, or strain I guess, that could be used as contrast. For example, these could be near in spacing, while jumps like these could use some more variable spacing based on pitches. By applying both of these, overall contrast between each of these sections would be heavily improved. And that is the general post for this insane. There was a singular timeline mod on this insane. Let me see if I remember what it was about. Oh, yeah, I remember. Okay. So, rhythm here could follow the vocal on with a 1/2 slider for differentiation with the full 1/2 span vocals. And same on the next pattern. All right, now we can finally move on to the top diff. So the first process here is essentially doing the exact same thing as the insane, except excluding the difference between the first and second ki, because the difference is a lot more noticeable there. So if we go on the top diff here, this first ki is generally like pretty high intensity. But I would definitely say that this density bumps it up a lot from the first ki, so the difference in contrast between the first and second ki is actually there in the map. The only real issue is that on the second ki, spacing doesn't really change that much depending on the pitches, which doesn't make that much sense. So the main issue here is just this part before the ki, which is still just a bunch of jump spam with variable spacing. It's too straining for like song intensity. Yeah, alright. So I'm going to post a note here. Link general insane post. There we go. Essentially the same issue on this diff as on the insane. The contrast between the first and second PIs is there, so not going to mention that. The main issue is just between the section before the first ki and the first ki itself. There we go. Then we explain sort of this type of thing. Again, section before the first ki is essentially just as straining to play, since there are a lot more circles, even if the ki itself includes more 1/4 rhythm. And spacing remains pretty consistent between jumps of both sections. This is even more of an issue on this diff due to how much the spacing varies on the jumps. Like repeatedly going from high spacing jumps to low spacing linear jumps, which arguably is a lot more straining on aim than the constant spacing jumps on the first ki. Like the insane, I'd recommend reworking some rhythms in the section before the first ki in order to create more visible contrast between it and the ki. So I will give roughly the same suggestions. I would. Mentioned on the insane. That's it. Since we linked the general insane post, they can just click that and they'll see, oh, these are the suggestions that they're talking about right here. And now the second general post. Alright, so Kiri, I'd like you to look at the second ki here, alright?
Yes.
And you know the song. It varies a lot in synths here. It's like, you know, right? Now, just look at the map, right?
Yeah, pretty big spacing throughout the entire thing. Very minimal differentiation.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like spacing changes much at all. Like the only real spacing changes between these small ones and then it goes into these ones, but in between these ones there's like no spacing difference. It's essentially just the same thing over and over again. Even though this is like clearly the song is building up here, but the spacing does not really reflect that. Would you nominate this map like this, Kiri?
Definitely not.
Good job.
Yeah. It is really the kind of map that wait, what is that?
Don't worry about it. I'm also gonna post about that, I'm pretty sure.
It's the kind of map that you use for BNF.
Wow, that's crazy because I'm using this for a BN application video. It's almost like I picked it for that reason. Okay, anyways. Okay. So, I'm gonna post a timestamp here. Spacing on this second ki between the jumps barely changes at all, despite the obvious intensity variations of the synth. Patterns like this. Just repeat almost exactly the same constant spacing over and over, despite the obvious increasing intensity of the synths in each case. It would heavily improve the song representation would heavily improve from varying the spacing according to song intensity rather than keeping it constant. So I highly recommend you add that spacing variation. Alright, now we are on the last stretch. So this first minor timeline mod I remember. Exactly. So spacing on these jumps is way too high for what are very weak fading out instrumentals. Which doesn't really fit like these two. Highly recommend nerfing these and adding gradual spacing reduction. Alright. Then, yeah, exactly. This very weird stream. I don't quite understand why they made that choice. Wow, I hit it. Well, it's a little bit unhinged. Yeah. This wiggle stream seems pretty excessive for a relatively calm part of the song. Kinda creating a diff spike in an otherwise very ordinary map. I would recommend he do something with like kick sliders to emphasize the distortions here. Or actually, no, that is fine. If you wanna have something to distinguish the vocal chops in the song, I would change the rhythm to something like this to represent it. Then a screenshot of that. Post that on Imgur. And with that, well, I am done with typing out every single mod here. And
Let's
so,
go.
there is only one step left, which is posting all of the mods.
Yeah,
So,
and then formatting everything
yeah,
and making sure everything is correct.
yeah, I have to do all that.
Yeah,
So first, obviously, HS mod right here, making sure that it's like properly formatted here. Yeah, it's perfectly readable, has spaces where I expect them to be. Normal, general problem stamp. I gotta make sure this one is properly formatted because it's a big one. Yep, the lines work as intended. And then this second general mod, a lot smaller. Then a singular one timeline post. Alright, so then the hard diff is just one big problem stamp general post, nothing else. Alright, insane. Now, should this be a suggestion or a problem stamp? Let me look at it just one more time. I think I'd be fine with making it a problem stamp. Oh, there was one timeline post on the insane. Alright, so I need to first have the link to this one here. General, go on insane, get this permalink, back to expert, back to general, and post a link here. So if it looks very long here, but when I post it, it'll get shortened down to its hashtag here. Yeah, so here's the suggestion stamp. Exactly, gets shortened right there. Then one more general post. I'll definitely make this a problem stamp just because it's a very obvious issue that would very obviously improve the map if it was changed. Then just 2 timeline mods. And that is essentially it. All the mods posted. Pretty sure all these screenshots are in the correct order. Yep, that looks appropriate with what I made. Alright, so with that modded, we have officially finished the second episode of my BN modding application guide, I guess, or BN application modding guide, I should say. This was the supposed bad map. Again, I'd like to reiterate, don't cyberbully this man, alright? He just made a map that happens to be of the exact type of quality that you would expect on a BN application mod. So don't cyberbully him because I call this map bad. It's not worth it. It's simply good for BN applications, and that's the end of the story. If anything, you should thank this man for making this map so that I could have a map to do this video on, so I could have content. So your sacrifice will be remembered, okay? Anyways, that's essentially it. Kiri, do you want to say anything before we leave?
Go mod, guys. Go mod.
Exactly. Don't forget, alright, this Kirishima guy applied 5 times, failed all 5 times, he applied 1 more time, and he finally got in. Never give up, okay?
Never give up.
I believe even if you take all of these guides together and you combine them and you apply them to your modding, even if you don't get in first try, just try again. If you don't get in second try, just try again. If you don't get in third try, just try again.
Yeah,
believe me.
Just keep trying until
Believe
you
me.
eventually get it.
Believe me, one of these applications, you will be at a level from all the feedback you've received from the NAT, from all the modding guides you've seen, from all the modding itself that you've done, all the feedback you've received, you will be able to get BN. So anyways, I'll see you next time on the 3rd video, which is probably going to be the shortest one. It's probably going to be like an hour 30 minutes. But yeah, see you next time.